Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, Chapter 2, Halacha 5. Yesterday, we were covering about work that could happen just before Rosh Hashanah for planting trees, and the trees take root in the 7th year. Now, the idea is that if you're planting something in the 7th year for a tree, you have to uproot it. And what the Gemara was doing in a sort of roundabout way was giving you a tool where you could figure out a tree that had to be uprooted from a neighbor or someone else. So what it was that in a normal tree that's planted in the 6th year, you have to plant it well before Rosh Hashanah. It will take root. Some say it takes 30 days to take root. The opinion of the Rashi was that it's going to be, for planting a tree, this 30-day buffer before Rosh Hashanah plus another 30 days for the tree to take root. And that puts the growth of the tree and the orla into the 6th year. But if you are putting the tree only a few days before Rosh Hashanah, on the 6th year, it will take root sometime in the 7th year, about a month later. And then the tree has a different calculation for orla. And so what will happen is, when you're coming to pick the fruit, everybody else in the orchard planted trees in the 6th year, they're going to be able to use the fruit about a year and a half earlier than the fellow who planted right before Rosh Hashanah of the 6th year, but it took root in the 7th year. The idea is that if something is taking root and you're going to get the productivity of it, and that's landing in the 7th year, then it's going to have sanctity to it. And the rule is you have to uproot the tree. So it gives you a way to look at some other guy's orchard and be like, hey, wait a second, you just planted those, a few years ago. And how come you're not using the fruit? We are, but you are not. And then you see it again for about a year and a half, because what happens is you're not able to use the fruit until the new year of the trees, which is going to be the 15th of Shvat. So what happens is it gives you a signal that these trees have to be uprooted, and you can, report it to the Sanhedrin or whatever, and, they'll compel him to uproot the trees. It's illegal. Now, Halacha 5 is going to get into the same kind of theme, but there's going to be some things that are going to have other kinds of uses in the just general term, like when you're doing other kinds of things like trumas and meiser and tithing. So when that's going to have a different kind of sanctity. Now, normally, agricultural plants that's going to be planted toward the end of the year before Rosh Hashanah, and as a general rule, let's say it does not complete its growth until the following year. So you can have it where you've planted it in the 6th year, it takes root in the 6th year in the halacha, but it doesn't start to actually grow until the 7th year. And it might even bloom and produce fruit in the 7th year. So that's going to have a certain standard of halacha, because that's going to be 6th year produce. It's not going to be 7th year produce. And something that you planted in the 7th year, and it doesn't take root until the 7th year, but it starts to bloom and blossom and produce fruit in the 8th year, that fruit is going to be 7th year produce. Now, we have a determination, and you have to make a determination as to whether this fruit is going to be subject to the restrictions and obligations for work, as well as whether this fruit is going to have Sheviis sanctity. And also, in the other years of the Shemitah cycle, it's going to deal with when you have to separate tithes from the crop. So as we were covering in Chapter 2, Halacha 4, if you planted this tree a few days before Rosh Hashanah, it's going to be a seventh year plant, and the fruit is going to have a delay of about a year and a half on when you can pick and use the fruit, because it has to go through Orlah, and then it has to wait until the tree no longer has a halachic standing as a sapling. You can only pick it from a mature tree, and that calculation is going to be the 15th of Shvat. That means that you have to wait until the 15th of Shvat to be able to use this fruit. But that's of the next year, again, about a year and a half. So these determinations are going to be factors. One of the key things that you want to look at for grain, olives, grapes, is going to be where it reaches 1/3 of its maturity. That's when it can start to be picked and used. What can you use immature grain for? Something that's 1/3. They used to have a dip that was a kind of food. It was very, very sour, and they would grind it and mix it with a yogurt. And so it did have a food use in the terms of the immature wheat grains. It would end up being very, very sour. So it did have a food use. And I believe that the immature grain was also used for a compound that could be used as a salve. So that would be a medical use. Now, in terms of grapes that would be immature, you can use that to make vinegar. And so that does have a use as well. Now other fruits, okay, so in grain, olives, and grapes, the measure of when it's going to be, quote unquote, a fruit, right, is going to be 1/3 of its maturity. Now, other fruits, that's going to be like an etrog. That's going to be the stage of emergence. And that's going to be where it's going to be where it actually isn't just like a bud, but it actually like turns into the fruit. And then vegetables are going to have a different one. And the vegetables are going to be when in the year that they're picked. So that's going to be the basis of this criteria for vegetables. So you have 3 categories you have to put into your mind on when this is going to be ready for the stage. So let's say you planted it at the end of the 6th year and it's going to come ready in the 7th year. What you're looking for in the first category, which is going to be grains, olives, and grapes, that's going to be where it reaches 1/3 maturity. Very easy to remember, by the way, because that's dealing with, say, four of the 7 species. Okay, you have wheat, you have barley, you have olives, you have grapes. So that's going to be 1/3 maturity, and it's going to be all grains. And then you have, for other fruit like the etrog or the fig or an apple or a peach, it's going to be the emergence. That's going to be where it actually starts to look like a fruit, turn into a fruit. And for the vegetables, it's going to be when they're picked. Now, in this emergence, there's 2 stages in it. First, it will flower, and then it will bud, and then it will actually turn into like a little fruit. And that's what it's talking about, this emergence. So the Mishnah starts off, and it says that rice, millet, by the way, is a very special grain in the halacha. Poppy, that's going to be these flowers that are used for seed. And sesame, that take root before Rosh Hashanah, are tithed according to the past year. So we're getting into tithes. And so this is saying, by the way, that took root before Rosh Hashanah. It could be of any year, not necessarily the 7th year. That's the insight by the Rambam. Now, the Rambam is going to continue to explain this a little bit. He's saying that if rice took root in the 7th year of the Shemitah cycle, so it was planted in the 6th year, took root in the 7th year, it is treated as 2nd year produce, even though it's harvested after Rosh Hashanah of the 3rd year. And it is therefore subject to the law of Meiser Sheni, not the law of Meiser Ani. Okay. Now, if rice took root in the 3rd year, before Rosh Hashanah of the 4th year, it is judged as produce of the past year. So that would be the third year. So that would make it subject to the law of Meiser Ani. So over here, rice, millet, poppy, sesame that took root before Rosh Hashanah are tithed according to the past year and permitted in Sheviis. So if you planted rice, millet, poppy, sesame, it takes root and it's picked in the 7th year. That's really 6th year produce, and you have to treat it as 6th year produce according to tithes. Now, not only that, what this is trying to say is if you planted the rice in the 3rd year and then the 4th year you pick it, that's going to be subject to the law of Meiser Ani. So it's not going to have the Meiser Sheni, which you normally have. It's going to put it back into the Meiser Ani rule. So basically, these crops are going to go back a year if you're at that border. Okay. Now, some crops are going to go forward a year. So we're going to get into that as well. So the Gemara continues, the Mishnah continues, and says, and they are permitted in Sheviis. So there's no problem. The Mishnah continues, says, but if they did not take root before Rosh Hashanah, they are forbidden in Sheviis. Again, the idea, so the Mishnah continues, says, and they are tithed according to the coming year. So the and there is not just making a rule for Sheviis, it's making a rule for every other year, as the Rambam's pointing out. So divide this up for a second. So you have rice, millet, poppy, sesame. Okay. If you planted it and it takes root right before the Sheviis year, okay, it's going to be okay, even if you pick it in the 7th year. Now, the and in that statement, and they are tithed according to the past year, that's a separate thing, okay? That's a separate thing. So now that's saying if you did this in the 2nd year and you picked it in the 3rd year, you're going to be tithing it according to the 2nd year. That deals with Meiser Ani, Meiser Sheni, okay? So don't read this as together where it's saying, and they are permitted in Sheviis and tithe according to the year, okay? These are two different halachas there. They're treated that way, okay? And in the next thing, it says, if they did not take root before Rosh Hashanah, they are forbidden in Sheviis. And then the next thing in there is going to be, when is it going to be tithed? Which year is it going to be tithed? Not necessarily just for Sheviis, but also for other years as well, where it says, and they are tithed according to the coming year. So again, read that separately. And what this is really saying is that if this was planted in the 4th year and it did not take root for the rice, millet, poppy, sesame until the 5th year, okay. I'm sorry, yeah, and in the 5th year, you're going to be tithing it the year back. So if you planted it, this rice, millet, poppy, sesame in the 4th year, and it does not take root until the 5th year, okay, you're going to be treating it like 4th year produce, and you're going to be tithing it with Meiser Ani. Now, in the other case that, it's going to be tithed according to the coming year. So if you, that means that if you planted it in the 4th year and it doesn't take root until the 5th year, you're going to treat it like 5th year produce, not 4th year produce. And conversely, where it says, and tithed according to the coming year, if you planted it in the 3rd year and it doesn't take root until the 4th year, then you're going to pick it and treat it with tithing according to Meiser Ani, not Meiser Sheni. So again, one of the things in the halacha that comes up again and again and again, also in Masechet Orlah, is going to be this idea of when does this get nutrition from the ground. So in the case of trees, it's going to be where is this root ball, when does this root ball start to get nourishment, okay? Where does it start to sustain the plant? Same too with, say, rice, millet, poppy, sesame. We're dealing and concerned with when does it take root, because that's when it starts to get nourishment from the ground. So if it doesn't take root until the Sheviis year, where it starts to get nourishment from the ground, well, that is going to classify it as Sheviis produce instead of, say, sixth year produce. It's not enough just to put it in the ground. It's really when does it start to draw nutrition. That's where you have to look at. Now, we were talking about these categories of rice, millet, poppy, and that they're going to be dealing with the year that they take root. That's the key idea. When does it take root? And there's going to be other Tanaim who are going to add other species. Rabbi Shimon Shezuri says, the Egyptian bean that one planted for seed from the very beginning is subject to the same criteria as these four species mentioned above. In other words, it's going to be assigned to the year it was given root. And Rabbi Shimon says large beans are subject to the same criteria as Egyptian beans. And Rabbi Lazar says only large beans that have formed pods before Rosh Hashanah are assigned to the previous year. Okay, so let's start looking at this. Okay, the Egyptian bean, okay, this is going to be where people are going to say it's a cowpea. And this is grown, in this case, says this Tana, this is going to be grown for the seed. It's going to be grown for the beans. It's not necessarily going to be, so why are you growing it for the beans? You're growing it because you want to plant more of them. Okay, you're creating seed crop. Okay, and by the way, one of the ideas is that you have to have this intention from the very beginning, he says. So sometimes in the halacha on planting or on something else, you can change your mind, you can change your intention. He's saying that the intention has to be from the very beginning that you've planted this for future plantings. You're not doing this to eat the greens. You're not doing this to eat the beans. You're doing it because you're trying to get more of the seed to plant in the future so that you can eat more beans in the future. And he's saying that if you've done this and you didn't change your intention, that the Egyptian bean is going to have the same criteria as these four species. And that means that you're going to look at the year where it takes root. Now, Shimon Bar Yochai is saying over here that he's just saying large beans. So large beans, that could also be chickpeas, and it could also be fava beans. So he's using different kind of species. He's broadening it out a little bit. Now, the Aramaic use for this word is where it's going to be large, right? He's saying large beans. That's going to be it's going to be afnin. Okay, so the Aruch is going to trace the origin of this word to megalon, which means large in Greek, and sometimes Greek does pop up. I'm sorry. The term is gamalonim, and that's going to be similar to the word megalon, which means large. So basically, it's going to be large beans that are like the Egyptian bean, and also he's agreeing that if these are initially planted for seed crop, okay, there's not for use for food. It's going to be just used for seed to plant future crops of this so that you can eat it at a later time. And imagine if you have a lot of chickpeas and you're growing it like this, like the rice or the millet, and you're going to take these chickpeas. You're not going to eat any of them. You're going to save all of them. You're going to put them into, cold, dry storage, and you're going to use them the following year. So they're saying that this is going to be assigned to the year in which it takes root. And basically, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is saying this is going to be any kind of these beans, not just the Egyptian bean. Rabbi Lazar is going to dissent. He's going to say only beans that have formed pods before Rosh Hashanah. So Rabbi Lazar is agreeing that it's going to be large beans. He's agreeing with Rabbi Shimon. It's going to be large beans. But what he's teaching is that in the year where it forms these pods, okay, that's where you're going to be counting the year. You're not going to be counting it from the root system, according to Rabbi Lazar. You're not going to be counting it in the year where it takes roots. You're going to be counting it in the year that it forms the pods. And if it forms the pods before Rosh Hashanah, then you're counting it in the previous year. So if you planted, according to Rabbi Lazar, these cowpeas, and you planted it and it takes root in the 6th year. And not only that, it also grows these pea pods in the 6th year. Then it's going to be treated as 6th year produce. But according to Rabbi Lazar, if you've planted these cowpeas in the 6th year and they form the pods in the 7th year, then you're going to assign it to 7th year produce. That's the idea by Rabbi Lazar. But Rabbi Lazar agrees with Shimon Bar Yochai that it's going to be large beans. It's going to be any large bean. So Shimon Bar Yochai is a little bit different than Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, because he's saying it's not just the cowpea, it's going to be any large bean. Okay, so like chickpeas or perhaps the fava bean. Fava bean was a big food source in Bavel as well as Eretz Yisrael. They find a lot of archaeology with a lot of fava beans in the digs. So it was a very common thing in the food source. So this is going to be treated like that. Now the Gemara is going to deal with rice, millet, poppy, sesame that takes root before Rosh Hashanah. They're going to be tithed according to the past year. And again, we're dealing with two different things in that Mishnah. We're dealing with one thing regarding Sheviis, and we're dealing with tithing, which could be in any year. Okay, the agreement on these two categories is going to be, when did this take root? When does it start to draw nutrition from the ground? That's going to be determination on tithing as well as Sheviis and what year this is. Okay. So the Gemara is going to give some background information about the criteria that's used to assign various types of produce to the appropriate year. And the Gemara reads, with regards to fruit, grain, olives, and grapes. Again, that's one of the categories that we were talking about. We're going to deal with that, again, with 1/3 maturity. And the Gemara says, the rabbis followed the point at which the produce reaches 1/3 maturity. And so it reaches 1/3 maturity for this. Easy way to think about it. You want to think about it in terms of 4 of the 7 species, right? It's going to be wheat, actually going to be any grain, but it's going to be, it could be oatmeal, it could be oats for oatmeal. But, basically it's going to be wheat, barley, olives, and grapes. Very easy to remember. We're dealing with this, we're 1/3, okay? So the Gemara continues, says, with regards to rice and other similar species that the Mishnah lists, the following point at which the plants take root, that's going to be when you're counting it. And so in other words, again, when does it take root to draw nourishment from the ground? And again, you have a lot of similarity to other laws like an Or law, where they're looking, when does this get nutrition from the ground? And then you have the next category, the 3rd category, we're dealing with crops of vegetables. And this, by the way, could be one of the reasons why there is a difference with vegetables and these large beans like cowpeas, because again, you're not using these cowpeas like regular vegetables. You're using it for seed crop so that you can grow future crops after the Sheviis year. So the Gemara says, and with regards to a crop of vegetables, the year of its tithing is determined by the time when it is picked. So that's going to be the idea here. Now, the Gemara's language here would seem to mean that when they're fully mature and ready for picking, that, by the way, is a little bit different than the 1/3 maturity that you're going to have with, grain and with olives and with grapes. Now, the Rambam in his Hilchos Shemitah 4:12, also, by the way, in Hilchos Meiser Sheni, is holding this view as well, that it's going to be when these vegetables are fully mature and ready for picking. And that's when you're going to determine when the tithing is. So very, very clever that the Mishnah has this other element of, hey, what happens if you're using this for seed crop? You're growing these large beans, which, by the way, are a big food staple, and we find that in the archaeology. There's a big, we're not using it for vegetables. We're not picking it in maturity because we're going to boil it up and eat it. No, we're using it so that, in the 9th year, we can take out our chickpea yield and plant it and use it. So we're not even eating it, they're saying. So you see that that's going to have a halacha that's going to be similar to the rice and millet, and when it's going to be taking root. So again, inside of this, for the vegetables, for, say, if you're growing cowpeas, you're going to have two categories. You're going to have cowpeas that are going to be ready to be picked, and then the year of the tithing is going to be determined by when you're picking these for consumption. And the other category for the vegetables, the cowpeas, is going to be where you're only using it for seed crop. So very important to categorize that in your mind. Now, the Gemara is going to discuss a scriptural basis for these three rules and these three categories. The Gemara is going to ask this very Yerushalmi-like question, and it's going to always ask, where do you know this from? What's the source on this? How do you know this? And it asks this here too. It says, from where in the Torah is there a basis for teaching that with regards to fruit, the rabbis followed the point at which the produce reaches 1/3 maturity? This, by the way, is going to be with, again, these four things, where it's going to have the grain, the olives, and the grapes. And the Gemara is going to quote the source from it, and it's going to say, and it's going to be quoting from Devarim 16:13. It's going to say, the festival of Sukkot you shall make for yourself 7 days, with your gathering from the threshing floor and from your wine vat. And the expression from your threshing floor implies not all of your threshing floor, and the expression from your wine vat implies not all from your wine vat. So let me explain this a little bit with the Mara Fulda's explanation about this. He's saying that the verse is referring to a crop that is being gathered at an early stage, when its yield is just a fraction of what it would produce if it were allowed to grow to completion. And we see from here that even a partially developed crop, like one that is grown to just 1/3 maturity, is considered fit for gathering, and it is therefore assigned to the previous year with regards to tithing, but also is also going to be assigned to the previous year, also regarding Sheviis. Again, you got to separate that out. There's going to be the tithing, that's one thing, and then also Sheviis. It happens that we're going to deal with this and assign it to the previous year. So the idea here, says Amara Fulda, is that the verse omitted the prefix with the mem, and where basically in Devarim, you know, in the quote, it's saying if it had omitted the mem, which would mean from, in both of these words, it would have simply stated, with your gathering of produce of your threshing floor and your wine vat, one would have thought that it's only going to be fully grown crop, and then you would understand it to be that any earlier stage would not be fit for gathering. Okay, but that's not what this verse reads. Okay, this verse has a mem in front of these, so that the verse indicates from your threshing floor and from your wine vat. In other words, it has this mem in front of this. It has it in front of threshing floor and in front of the wine vat. And the Mara Fulda says that the Gemara is trying to mean that it indicates that even a crop that has achieved only a portion of its potential growth is going to be a significant enough crop for it to be gathered. And again, there's going to be some uses for grain that can be a third ripe. So the not only as a food source, but also as medicinal. Now, the Gemara doesn't like this explanation, and it's going to ask a question. It says, but now on the basis above, with this mem in here, even produce that is grown to less than a third of its maturity before Rosh Hashanah should be assigned to the previous year, as the verse does not specify any minimum degree of development. So, in other words, they're saying that if you're going to read this mem as saying immature crop, well, it doesn't preclude anything that's less, you can have something that's less mature than even 1/3. So what do you do with that? Gemara is going to answer that. And Rabbi Zera says, it is written, you shall tithe the entire crop of your planting. This, by the way, is going to be in Devarim 14:22. And the Gemara reads that the expression of your planting conveys that tithing is applicable only to something that can be planted and will eventually sprout. And that's going to be to the exclusion of produce that has grown less than 1/3 of maturity, which can, because it's immature, it cannot be planted and eventually sprout. So in other words, the idea here is that if you're planting something that's less than 1/3 mature, it can't sprout. And so really what this is saying is they're saying that you shall tithe the entire crop of your planting. And because something that's less than a third mature can't be planted, it's just going to rot in the ground. It doesn't have enough viability. So that's really saying that only something that's 1/3, while it's immature, can eventually sprout. And so this is basically teaching that the crop becomes subject to tithing as well once it reaches the 1/3 stage development. And why is that? Why is this 1/3 stage development magical? Because this is the point where if you took this for olives, for grapes, for the grain, and you were to take it at 1/3 maturity, it would eventually sprout and be viable. And if you took it at less than 1/3, where you took it after only a couple of days, and a few days before this 1/3 maturity, then they're saying that this seed that you planted would not be viable and would never sprout. So that's what it's saying. You shall tithe your entire crop of your planting. And they're saying from this that this is not a crop of your planting because it's immature. It will never be a planting. It will never sprout. That's what it's saying. So this is a good way to understand the nature of tithes, and also why the tithing on these are also going to be at 1/3. Because again, it's this, you shall tithe the entire crop of your planting, and anything that's less than 1/3 doesn't grow if you plant it, but anything that's 1/3 ripe or more in terms of the grain, the olives, and the grapes. If you plant it at 1/3 maturity, it will sprout. Now the Gemara is going to object that it's going to, why, all of the produce is going to be assigned to the year in which it reaches this 1/3 stage. In other words, how do you know it's going to be before and not after? How do you know that? That's what the Gemara is going to be asking. And the Gemara is going to answer it, but here's the question. So the Gemara asks this question. It says, but now perhaps we should say that the first third of the crop, which developed before Rosh Hashanah, is tithed according to the past year, but the second third of the crop, in other words, that's the remaining growth, which developed after Rosh Hashanah, would be tithed according to the coming year. How do we know? What this is really asking is, how do we know that the entire crop is going to be assigned to the year in which the first third developed? So what this is saying, this is saying, let's say you planted these grapevines, or let's say you planted this wheat, and let's say it grows to 1/3 maturity, and that exact date comes one day before Rosh Hashanah. So definitely took root, definitely planted well before Rosh Hashanah of the 6th year, and this magical date comes where, this 1/3 maturity comes one day before Rosh Hashanah, right before the Sheviis year. It's saying, okay, from Sheviis onward, you don't pick it until, it comes fully mature, and you're picking it actually in the Sheviis year. So the Gemara is asking, why wouldn't you treat the rest of this growth like Sheviis produce? In other words, why is that cutoff where it grows to 1/3 maturity, say even one day before the Sheviis year, where it starts at Rosh Hashanah? Why are you counting all the rest of the growth still as 6-year produce? That's the question. The Gemara is going to answer. Rabbi Yochanan says it is derived from the fact that the phrase "from your threshing floor" and "from your wine vat," which is the source of the 1/3 criterion, as the Gemara explained, is written in a passage dealing with the festival of Sukkot. And Rabbi Yochanan says this creates the following analogy. It says, just as we find regarding the festival of Sukkot that it is in reality part of the coming year, because of the chronology, it follows Rosh Hashanah, the Gemara says, but nevertheless, you treat it as part of the past year. So the Gemara's logic here is based on the verse of Devarim 31:10. That's going to be the mitzvah of hachechel, which is where the king would assemble all the people and read. And that's going to be over there. It's going to say at the end of 7 years during the appointed time of Shemitah on the festival of Sukkot. Now, let's explain this. Mara Fulda says, although the 7th year of the Shemitah cycle has already concluded by the time Sukkot arrives, the Torah still associates this festival with the year of Shemitah. And what he's basically saying, what Rabbi Yochanan is basically saying, is that evidently, in a certain sense, Sukkot is judged as being part of the previous year. And where would that be judged as being part of the previous year? It's going to be dealing with that with regards to the crops. So the Gemara continues and says, but nevertheless, you treat it as part of the past year. And so too regarding these crops that achieved 1/3 maturity before Rosh Hashanah, although they are for the most part a product of the coming year, you nevertheless treat them with regards to tithing in accordance of the past year. That's the idea. So he's saying over here, just like you're doing the assembly with the king who would read the Torah for the assembled people, the verse literally says in Devarim 31:10, at the end of 7 years, which means that the Shemitah cycle ended, during the appointed time of the year of Shemitah on the festival of Sukkot. And so really what this is saying is that, yes, 7th year of the Shemitah cycle ended, Sukkot arrived, but the Torah is still associating it with the year of Shemitah. And so too here, they're doing the same thing with the crops based upon this verse that we were talking about, where we're talking about from the threshing floor and from the wine vat. So they have a gezerah shava from here and from there, and that this is being treated in terms of like when do you count this? Okay, not exactly a gezerah shava, maybe it's a binyan av, but anyway, this is being treated as with the same logic over here and over there. And so that's going to be the scriptural source for the 1/3 criteria. This, by the way, again, is for grain, olives, and grapes. And now the Gemara is going to investigate why the species mentioned in the Mishnah are going to be subject to a different standard. In other words, okay, we talked about grain, grapes, and wine. We understand that, yes, we understand that this is going to be something that, has a couple of scriptural sources for it. Again, it says from your planting. It has to at least be 1/3 ripe in order for it to be viable, so that if you did take this 1/3 ripe wheat and wheat kernel and planted it, it would sprout and eventually grow a grain. But anything that had less than 1/3 maturity would never grow. And tomorrow we're going to be covering about this other stuff, about these other, what's going to make rice, millet, poppy, sesame different from this 1/3 requirement. What's going to make it different? So there's a lot of merit that you have for learning about the details, implications, and nuances of the laws of Sheviis, and it's really great to do because we're learning a lot of very important ways to read and understand the Torah that's been passed down by this tradition. And we're seeing a lot of really amazing new stuff and how they are getting this Torah Baal Peh tradition and understanding how the law comes about out of it. That's what's so magical about the Yerushalmi. It's really pulling the halacha right out of the scripture. Nobody alive today has that level of understanding or that tradition to do it. You have to have that tradition. But we're seeing some really amazing things and depth and beauty in the Torah. Have a great day.